There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod. And for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some moles. Welcome back to Kira Cassidy, who's back on the podcast with us. But her associate, Connor Meyer, actually reached out with some brand new research that you both are doing. So Connor Meyer, for all of you who, Kira, just so we can update you guys, just past the 10-year mark. She is a biologist and research associate with Yellowstone Forever. So congratulations, Kira, for passing that milestone. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so Connor is a PhD student in wildlife biology at the University of Montana. And Connor, it's awesome to have you here for the first time. So how are you doing, man?
Yeah, thanks for having both Kira and myself on. I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for reaching out. And it's so great that you all are. It seems that we've gotten a little bit more influx of people who are reaching out to us. We're not scary people, so you guys can certainly email us. And, 90% of the time we're going to have, or actually 100% of the time we'll have you on. So looking forward to this. So just delve into, I guess I'll start with Connor. Just talk about your working background and relationship with Kira. How did this come together? Did you both come to the paper and the research that we're talking about initially, or did you both sort of converge on it at the same time? So I guess we'll start with Connor, and then Kira will go with you and see how that goes.
Yeah. So I guess I first came to Yellowstone National Park in 2016. I had just graduated from my undergrad and kind of showed up to the park bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and would kind of do whatever people asked me to do. As far as hiking, skiing, learned how to ski, which was super fun.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of I ended up working in Yellowstone for both the Wolf Project and the Cougar Project for a little over 5 years. And throughout that time, a lot of the work that I did was focusing on kind of the wolf and cougar predation aspects of what they're eating, where they're eating it, that kind of stuff. But I had, back in my undergrad, kind of heard about this parasite, Toxoplasma gondii, that we're going to be talking about today. And it was always kind of in the back of my mind that it would be really awesome to look at in any sort of predator-prey capacity or any sort of wild system, really. And so, sitting next to Kira for over 5 years, working in the wolf office, kind of put me at an awesome opportunity to kind of bug her as much as I could about wolf social dynamics and the different ways that wolves interact. And then so we kind of just came to this idea of like, well, we have 26 years of wolf collar data, behavior, observation, and then blood serum. So like, why don't we see if Toxo's in this system, which was actually the initial study on whether or not Toxoplasmosis was in the wolves was done by one of our co-authors on this paper, Ellen Brandell, and she found that it was in Yellowstone National Park. And so after discovering that, Kira and I, as well as another co-author, Aaron Staler, decided to let's dive deep into this. Let's see kind of what effect this parasite is having on wolf behavior, and then also what different factors, whether it's wolf demographics, so sex or age, or where wolves are actually in the park, is better at predicting whether or not wolves are going to test positive for this parasite.
So Kira, just describe Toxoplasmosis and the parasite and what the disease, from what I could gather with the chart that you guys sent, a lot of this, and it's good because, Connor, as you said, you worked with both the Cougar and the Wolf Project, and it really seems that there's this relationship between the cougar and the wolf in this passing of the parasite and this disease that initially, they eat off a kill essentially, and then the parasite gets passed. So Kira, just go into Toxoplasmosis and why this is such an important disease and a parasite to research.
Connor mentioned showing up in Yellowstone. I'd had this research position for a while, but he really, I think, kind of got me excited, and other people here, including Arian Staler, excited about the possibilities of what it looks like in a wild system, because no one had really studied that in a wild system before. It was usually lab-based work, or just kind of like a snapshot of a handful of people here and there. And in the wild, you really needed, like Connor mentioned, not only blood samples to be able to test for seroprevalence, but also in order to get any kind of information beyond that, just positive or negative, whether it has impacts beyond those things, you needed to have all of this behavioral research. And what better place to try and figure that out than wolves in Yellowstone? As you guys know, there are some packs that we watch for hundreds of days out of the year. And so we have an incredible bank of this behavioral data. And so we wanted to kind of throw all of those things together. And Toxo is this really interesting mechanism for doing that, or avenue for doing that. And it's a fascinating organism. It's a parasite. So it's very similar to like malaria or giardia or something. But it has this interesting life cycle in that it needs a felid, so a cat system, in order to sexually reproduce. And so it has all of these different life cycles, but it can only complete it in a cat system. And so we knew that there are cats here. Of course, there's mountain lions, or cougars as we refer to them here. And there are bobcats in very low numbers, and then every once in a while a lynx will come through, but cougars are kind of the ones that are at the highest number right in this area. And as Connor mentioned, we tested, Ellen Brandel tested the wolves in actually a bunch of different places in North America, including Yellowstone, found that it was here, which kind of was this very light bulb moment of like, what's happening beyond that? Because if it needs that cat system and it's in the wolves, then what does the whole system look like? And how is it moving through the ecosystem? Is it in the water? Is it in the elk? We had all kinds of questions. We actually had to pare down our research questions by what, Connor, probably like an order of magnitude, to try and make a reasonable paper out of this. And so, yeah. Wow. A lot of really fun conversations. Connor knows the background, kind of the literature that's already been published on Toxo really well. And I kind of came in to help with the analysis, and especially the behavior analysis for the paper. And that's how we kind of work together to figure out our questions.
Yeah, I think I was looking at it this morning. We've got about 10 pages of like ideas and sentences and stuff for this.
Now that you guys are talking, I've seen videos before that they came with no description, but now I'm wondering if these things are connected. So you have like a rodent coming out of a drain pipe and all of a sudden acting completely erratically, getting in a cat's face, jumping at their mouth, and then of course they're getting preyed on because they're making themselves an easy target. So I think I'm connecting the dots here, is that's the type of behavior that would assist this virus passing from prey to cat. It kind of causes them to behave outside of what would be advantageous to an animal that's trying not to get eaten. Is that the type of behavior that is caused by this parasite? So
that's probably like those videos or any of those examples or anecdotes are probably like the most extreme kind of versions of something that infection with Toxoplasma gondii could cause. So behavior in wildlife or in any animal, including humans, is like really hard to pinpoint exactly what's causing that. And so a lot of these different studies that have been done experimentally, where, they're not in a wild system, they're in a lab, and they will experimentally infect mice or rats with Toxoplasmosis, and then they will have others that aren't, and they kind of observe different behaviors. And some of those behaviors can be very subtle, as much as like increased movement rates, where like infected individuals are a little more sporadically moving across the landscape or across the lab. They have also found that there's this kind of decreased neophobia in infected individuals. And so neophobia is just kind of the innate fear of new things. And so if you're, a prey species, kind of take it broader than just a rodent, it can be very disadvantageous to be like not afraid of new things that you don't understand, right?
Right.
And so if you
with teeth, things with
exactly,
teeth.
yeah, because especially when you look at felids and the way that felids hunt, where they're stalk and ambush predators, and so for the most part they're hiding somewhere in brush. And so if there's something new, or if there's an individual that's infected, and they're kind of seeking out either new behaviors, or they're going into new places that are deemed riskier, the likelihood of them getting consumed, the parasite being passed back up to the felid, and then the felid spreading more parasite in its feces. And what we one of the stages that Kira mentioned is called oocysts. And so if once a cat is exposed to this parasite, they will, when they defecate, they'll kind of spread thousands to, in some cases, millions of these little oocysts in the environment. And these oocysts are super hardy, where in some environmental conditions, they can last up to and over a year on the landscape.
Jeez.
And so that's one way that we think that a lot of humans can get infected, and a lot of wildlife species can, because these oocysts can be passed on. Just whether it's if we're thinking about wild species, if a cat defecates in some grass or in any sort of landscape where you might have grazers like ungulates or elk or
Cows,
deer,
yeah.
They could just kind of go by, munching on grass, and they might pick up some of these oocysts and then become infected. These oocysts can also, if they're kind of deposited in or near water, or there's heavy rainfall, or even maybe snow, they can get into water sources. And just by drinking untreated water, any warm-blooded species can get infected. So I was actually just looking up earlier, there's been a number of human exposures or outbreaks that people believe have been linked to drinking untreated water in, whether it's actually traced back to cougars or bobcats or lynx defecating near like reservoirs, and then like whole, townships can possibly get infected if that's the case. A lot of that evidence is really tough to actually tell exactly where this is coming from. But there's a big story in 1995 in Victoria, where over 100 people all seemed to get infected around the same time, and they think it was probably traced back to this like infected reservoir.
Okay, so you need an intermediate feline, or people can pass it between people, wolves can pass it to other wolves, or wolves can pass it to humans, let's just say, or the initial vehicle has to be a cat?
Yeah, that's a great question. We should cover that. So through oocysts, so felids are the only thing that can produce these oocysts, which is the kind of consequence of sexual reproduction, which can only happen in felids. However, when any individual either ingests these oocysts, or if they ingest infected muscle tissue, which I'll talk about in a second, the infection goes essentially from their gut, crosses the gut lining, and then spreads to their muscle tissue and their brain. So any warm-blooded species can become infected with toxoplasmosis, or can contract toxoplasmosis. And so there is a little bit of, we can pass on humans. The only way that a human is going to pass this on in general is through if we were to be consumed by another animal. And that's the same with, rats, like any intermediate host. So an intermediate host is anything that can be infected but does not complete a like sexual reproductive life cycle. So any warm-blooded species can be an intermediate host, so is capable of infection. And then if that individual is consumed by any other warm-blooded species, that the one that consumed it can then become infected. Only felids are capable of producing these oocysts, but any warm-blooded species can be infected via oocyst or from ingesting infected muscle tissue. So this is kind of one of the big like PSAs that we're going to give is like one of the three main ways that we think that humans are infected is either through house cats. So there is a chance, a lot of times that the kind of medical advice for persons who are or can become pregnant is don't clean a litter box, or, have their partner clean a litter box. Or if you do, clean it every single day, because there's some evidence that these oocysts need to be exposed to the environment for 24 hours before they're infectious. So if you keep things super clean, it should be okay. But just to be safe, make sure that if you are a person, or if there is a person in your household who is pregnant or trying to become pregnant, that person shouldn't be cleaning a litter box if you have cats. Related to that, keep your cats inside. It's the best way to stop them from eating rodents to possibly become infected with toxo. So those two things are kind of related. The other two ways of infection is kind of drinking water. So again, don't drink unfiltered water, which for most of us probably isn't a problem. And then the last one is either fully cook your meat. So anyone who likes rare or undercooked meat, there is a chance of infection through that. Or if you freeze your meat for up to and over 72 hours, so 3 days, that has a pretty good chance of killing the cysts that are within muscle tissue. And then the other one is wash your vegetables. So again, if you have, cats in your neighborhood, domestic cats in your neighborhood, walking through your garden, defecating, wherever cats do, you just want to make sure you wash all your vegetables to get any sort of oocysts off of vegetables.
And the warnings are pretty key here, but just for a little bit of background on human infection, it may be in some places that as many as 50% of people have this already and have no idea. In some places, it's as low as 10%, in other places, as much as 60%. Kind of the average, if you put the whole globe together, is like 30-ish%. So 1 out of every 3 people have it, and almost everybody has no idea that they do. It's generally not symptomatic. It usually doesn't cause anybody any problems unless they are immunocompromised somehow, or trying to get pregnant or already pregnant. For people that are exposed and get infected for the first time while pregnant, it can be extremely dangerous and even fatal to the fetus. And that has been shown in animals as well. That's not, in wild animals and laboratory animals. That's not just humans. And so that is the major concern there. And that's why we may, even though it's so prevalent in humans across the world, and in some hot spots, more than half of the people, that may be why we don't actually hear that many warnings about toxoplasmosis, because generally 9 out of 10 people at least who get it will have no idea their whole life.
Wow, man, it seems like an invasive and just, it kind of seems like it's a badass parasite that there's no, it just lives consistently. Is this one of these parasites that can it be killed in any way? Is it just one of those that it's just going to live basically forever? I don't know if you guys have any idea specifically about the parasite itself and its lifespan, and what if there's a way to approach it,
Yeah, it can last kind of a shockingly long time, as Connor mentioned, like in certain good conditions over a year on the landscape in that oocyst stage. And yeah, I think we discussed this a little bit, and part of the kind of major prevalence, we don't know what it looked like, 10,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. It probably has cycled through most of the globe, anywhere that has felids, really, which is most places. And in a lot of places, there were wild felids in huge numbers, especially in North America and Africa and Asia. And so right now, those are kind of replaced by domestic felids. And whether there are what, 600 million to a billion domestic cats throughout the globe right now, that's feral and pets. And so maybe there are more individual felids in the world now than there were 10,000 years ago. Of course, 10,000 years ago, most of them were a lot bigger, but that maybe doesn't make that big of a difference to something like toxo.
So if you were looking at an X-ray of a wolf, for example, where would you see these parasites in its body?
If you in a wolf that's infected, it's going to go through, and this is the same with humans. There's kind of two stages of infection. The first one is the acute infection, or kind of from now on, I'll just refer to it as the primary infection stage. And then there's the chronic infection stage, or the secondary infection. And so once you consume, or a wolf, let's say, consumes infected meat, or infected drinking water, whatever, they will go through this primary infection stage, and that's the acute infection. And so that's typically where, in humans and in any wildlife, if you see symptoms that are not behavior related, this is where you're going to see them. So, and this is kind of where it starts to spread from the gut lining to the muscle tissue. And the muscle tissue, as far as we know, can be any muscle tissue. So, any kind of typical muscle you would expect. However, there does seem to be kind of increased prevalence found in like lung tissue. Brain tissue is going to be, the next one that I'll talk about. And so there are certain places where it seems like this infection kind of centers, but it can be found in any sort of muscle tissue. So the second thing that it does is it also goes to the brain, and that's where it develops cysts. And this is where kind of all evidence points to the fact that this is where it might have an effect on behavior. And so you're not necessarily going to see any sort of evidence in kind of bone structure or anything like that, but you would possibly see, with advanced microscope, like you wouldn't be able to look at meat and see infection. It would have to take either kind of this antibody serum testing, which is what we did, is we took blood from wolves, spun it down to just the blood serum, and then we tested for antibodies in that. So you'd either need that, or you would need a lab to look at muscle tissue itself, stain it, strap it to a microscope, and actually look for the cysts themselves in the muscle tissue. So it's really tough to kind of identify without the modern advances we've had. And that's one interesting thing about its history, is that there's some evidence pointing back to Toxoplasma gondii's closest relative being, or closest species relative, most recent common ancestor being anywhere from 4 to 150 plus thousand years ago. So it's been around for a long time. However, in kind of the modern medical history, we've only known, quote unquote, known about toxo for about 100 years. And it was actually kind of really interesting history of it, but it's one of those things that kind of has evolved with felids and warm-blooded species for so long that it is very subtle. And it kind of, to anthropomorphize it a little bit, like it's natural selection has selected on it so much that it seems to really know what it's doing to be kind of pervasive through the landscape.
So when it gets into the brain, because you guys said it can migrate from the muscle tissue to the brain. Is this where you guys are seeing these dynamic changes in behavior in canids and wolves, and where they're taking, reading through your the chart that you gave us, and basically the risk taking, the dispersal, making these almost uneducated decisions that wolves typically wouldn't make if unless there was something basically in there that was chemically imbalanced. Is this a late stage parasitic thing that happens with wolves, or does it happen almost instantaneously? How long does it take for you to see that behaviorally, I guess, in wolves, or are you guys still working on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the timing of this actually ended up really important in our analysis, because we had to kind of cut a wolf's life into two separate parts from before they were sampled and after they were sampled. And we had to use that sample date as kind of like the seesaw point and figure out which part of that wolf's life we were going to focus on. And it all depended on whether they tested positive or negative. So if a wolf tested positive, we knew at least it was positive that day. And we know because they're positive for the rest of their life with this type of infection, we paid really close attention to what it did from the time of the sample to their death. For wolves that tested negative, well, maybe they were exposed the very next day. We don't know.
Right.
So we kind of have to ignore the rest of their life. And we had to only focus on from the time of their birth until the time of that test. And for some wolves, that's only a couple of weeks. For some wolves, that was years. And so for every wolf, it was slightly different timing wise. But as Connor mentioned, the cysts in the brain start to form a couple of weeks after the ingestion of the oocysts from the environment. And so, based on lab work, I think we can probably fairly confidently say it works similarly with wolves, where those behavioral effects, because the cysts are forming in different parts of the brain, the behavioral effects are probably occurring at least a few weeks out from initial exposure and infection, that primary infection, for the rest of their life, because the cysts are forming and they're generally not going away and not changing all that much throughout the rest of the wolf's life. And depending on where the cysts form, there's still a lot left to figure out about this parasite. People are doing a ton of work on it, but there's still a lot of work and a lot left to try and understand, especially about the brain, where they form, how that impacts certain hormones. There does seem to be a link to especially testosterone and dopamine. And Stephen mentioned the behavior of the mouse that was like jumping up at the cat's face in reference to this disease. And that actually, as Connor mentioned, that was kind of the extreme visual of that behavior. But over and over again in these lab studies, that was shown where the rodents, the cysts will form in the brain and mess with the testosterone and dopamine production and uptake, because in order to make the rat or mouse or whatever it is take more risks. If we can kind of give the parasite a personality for a second, it wants to complete its life cycle. It wants to get back into a cat system at all costs. And so, it's essentially wants its host to be eaten by a cat in the end. So what do? Make them either seek out cat scent, be attracted to it, or just not be as cautious or as afraid. And so that's why we started to think, well, if this infection, if this parasite is in the wolves, if it's causing these cysts on their brain as well, because we know it's in all kinds of animals. It's in humans, it's in chimpanzees, it's in hyenas. There's a really cool hyena study that just came out last year. Maybe Connor can talk about that a little bit later. But if it's in the wolves, then what are they? Is it having any kind of outplay, in their behavior? And so we started brainstorming, what would a risky thing be for a wolf? Like if you were a wolf, what would a risky choice look like? And of course, a wolf's life is pretty risky in general. If you everything they do involves some amount of risk. But the list that we came up with was disperse from your pack, because you're leaving kind of the family unit and going out on your own, becoming a pack leader, or what used to be called alpha. That will take some certain amount of risk taking and also aggression. That's maybe tied to the testosterone a little bit there. And then going close to people. So being habituated, getting close to vehicles, walking right past people, maybe even walking through developed areas, which is a data point that we keep track of in Yellowstone. And then also dying of certain causes. And we have enough data here to kind of divide that up into dying from a human. So that would be like, being hunted outside of Yellowstone or being hit by a vehicle or being killed by another wolf. And we kind of had this list of 5 different things, 3 of them behaviors, 2 of them causes of death, that we decided this is kind of the most risky stuff that a wolf can do. And are we going to find any patterns here when we look at the ones that are positive and the ones that are negative, and how many of them do those behaviors or die those certain ways?
You started with a lot of, wild individual effects, but you also mentioned some broader implications. I'm wondering if we can dive into that just a tiny bit more. Like, in your mind, what's the largest impact of toxoplasmosis that you can hypothesize on a pack scale, or even even an entire state's population scale, like the broadest implication? I mean, i.e., like if you used a prediction software that models impacts of a given thing, and you tried to model the outcomes of a wolf pack that had a ton of toxoplasmosis running through the pack versus a pack that had 0, let's just say, hypothetically, is there a meaningful, perceivable, or measurable impact, or is it mostly, very particular behaviors in very individual animals?
So yeah, I think it is really interesting to look at this, and we definitely had a lot of fun discussing kind of what the implications of this might possibly be. And so, on the individual level, and some of this is definitely speculation. Some of it we think is very well supported in our results. And so we think, on the individual level, an individual that may be more likely to disperse, or an individual that may be more likely to become a pack leader, would actually, possibly have increased reproductive probabilities or chances. Or, if you look at dispersal and how kind of dangerous dispersal might be for any number of reasons, whether that's, getting killed by other wolves when you're trying to join a pack, or if, dispersal takes you in a landscape that is not, as protected as a place like Yellowstone National Park, you could possibly, get harvested by hunters in any sort of state that has a hunting season for wolves. You might, get hit by a car, you might get hit by a train. Like, there's so many different things that might possibly happen. And there's, so much evidence of kind of crazy dispersals for wolves in the West that, on that individual level, it could, possibly go either way of, increased dispersal could possibly lead to really awesome reproductive benefits because you find a pack mate, you start a pack, you have, a number of pups, and you survive for a while reproducing, or you disperse and, you travel for a few days, a few weeks, and you run into, 10 other wolves that don't want you to join their pack, and you possibly get killed. So this is kind of one of the future directions we're thinking about going. But I think really for wolves on a kind of population level, and I think this might be a good spot for Kira to jump in, is looking at wolves and how kind of knowledge or, what we've kind of called culture might be passed on from infected individuals to uninfected individuals. So, wow. Kira.
Yeah. Thanks, Connor. So, if we had looked at all of different kinds of behaviors and found that were aligned with being, we have a lot of data in Yellowstone on the value of those wolves. We have a lot of data in Yellowstone on the value of those older individuals in the pack. And so when we started looking at that and what that means for the entire pack, and it seemed like if you have certain wolves that are making a lot of the pack decisions, where they're traveling, what they're eating, if those ones are more likely to be toxopositive, and it seems like they are because the leadership and the dispersal is something that the positive ones do much more often, then are there kind of fallout from that for the rest of the pack mates? Are they, in fact, seeking out cat scent, which would be really pretty critical for the rest of the pack maybe even getting infected more often. You know, if you have your leader who's infected, who's attracted to cat scent, wants to chase cats up the tree. And when I say cats, I mean cougars. I don't mean, you know, domestic cats here, but wants to chase a cougar up a tree, then all the rest of the pack mates generally go with that leader and follow their example. And not only are there in the moment, but maybe learning that, hey, this is what we do as a pack and as a wolf. We smell a mountain lion and we want to go chase it, or we smell a mountain lion and we take over the kill, or we eat mountain lion scat, which of course happens a lot. We think it's very much anyone who's had a dog and a cat at the same time. Some of the dogs want to be in the litter box all the time, and we have this kind of litter box hypothesis that the wolves are actually eating mountain lion scat and possibly being infected that way. And so maybe those uninfected pack mates are actually learning, you know, we take risky behaviors, and it's passing on that risk-taking kind of culture without infection. And sometimes it, of course, would be leading to more infection if it's kind of centered on chasing those mountain lions who are passing on that life cycle that they need to be exposed to get infected themselves.
Do you guys, do either of you think that this is something that could be or is already on the level of what CWD is for the ungulate population? Or is this something that is fairly, I don't even want to say contained, but is it something that isn't as wide? I mean, it seems as though it's everywhere. So is it something that wolf populations throughout the United States and into Canada, this is something that needs to be worried about in terms of wolf restoration, wolf population, wolf study, or is it sort of hit and miss at this moment? I mean, we know CWD is moving across, you know, in all ungulate populations. Is it something on par with that, or am I overshooting?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely something that we all need to be, you know, thinking about or asking whenever we're dealing with any sort of infectious disease, right? Like, we currently are and have dealt with years of what happens when infectious disease kind of, you know, jumps or spills over into humans. And so kind of this idea of the impact that pathogens or parasites may have on species or populations is super important. I think that toxoplasmosis, though, is one of those things where it's not, you know, I don't think that comparing it necessarily to CWD, they're just two different things where, you know, toxoplasmosis is capable of causing death in immunocompromised individuals, or can, you know, cause, in wolves specifically, there's the chance that it could possibly cause pregnant wolves to like lose their litters. But I don't think that it's going to be affecting populations on a population-wide scale. And I think, you know, one other thing that both Kira and I kind of wanted to talk about and, you know, mention for sure is we found these really interesting results. But we know that, you know, what we ended up finding was that wolves that had been exposed to toxo, so they were what we call seropositive, were 11 times more likely to disperse and 46 times more likely to become a pack leader. So very kind of surprising and interesting results. And Kira and I did as much as we could to double, triple check, make sure that wasn't kind of blown out of proportion. But I think it's really important to kind of bring up the fact that like toxoplasmosis is not what causes before wolves had toxo, it's not like they weren't dispersing or they weren't becoming leaders. So I think that some of these effects that we're seeing for wolves or have been seen in other species, it's really subtle and it almost just heightens some of these behaviors. But I don't think necessarily that we could say, given our results or even the literature, that toxo is like a driving any sort of population level change, or, you know, whether that's mortalities or reproduction. I think it's kind of one of many cogs that kind of go into these different behaviors that we observed. So, Kira, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah. The only thing that I would add is that when you talk about behavior of especially a wild animal, evolution seems to have this like really beautiful way of keeping things balanced at a time scale that is beyond anything that we are studying or people after us will study, thousands of years scales, where if a wolf or say a wolf pack or a wolf population kind of inches up their kind of aggression, let's just call it aggression levels or risk-taking behavior or something, there are checks in place, especially for an animal like a wolf that does a lot of dangerous things, where that might be beneficial once in a while, but if it increases their chances that they die, or the other way of saying that is it lowers their survival rate, then it's going to stop that behavior pretty quickly. And so there's really no chance in the wolf that this kind of is like runaway behavior where all of a sudden a bunch of wolves are taking all kinds of crazy risks, because they live such dangerous lives that you can't take that many risks as a wolf without dying unless you're super lucky. And so there's kind of like an evolutionary check and balance on this kind of stuff that will prevent it from kind of, the pandemic or, like exploding out of control behavior wise. And maybe, there are different ways that it can affect them physically that would be a little bit more interesting, like Connor talked about, possibly impacting their reproduction or something. And that may be something that we look at in the future. But behaviorally, there's a lot of things to kind of keep that balance, so to speak, to keep the species moving forward without doing too many crazy things to lower survival, and also making sure survival doesn't go too high for any reason. This is kind of what the purpose of evolution, and especially in a community like we have here in Yellowstone, where there's a lot of species kind of.
This might be a stupid question, but does this at all complicate the observations of the past, looking at what might be considered habituation and what causes that? Like, I'd be so curious to know how many animals that seem habituated in the classic sense are infected with toxoplasmosis, and and their behaviors just kind of manifest in a similar way. But purely out of curiosity, do you think if you were to study the most habituated individuals in Yellowstone, that they would likely be infected with toxoplasmosis, or are these just very separate things?
So that was a part of this analysis, actually, and it was maybe Connor can speak to this too. It's a slightly disappointing result because it didn't end up showing too much of a pattern or correlation, I should say, to toxo as the other behaviors did. But the huge caveat with that is that it was the smallest data set. We only really have, for wolves that we termed habituated, meaning that they got within 10 meters of a person or a vehicle that we knew about and recorded. It was only, I think, a couple, like 28 or something wolves. Only some of those had been tested for toxo, because not all of the wolves are tested, only the, most of the collared ones. So all the uncollared ones weren't. And so we were working with a really small data set there. We had trouble, accounting for repeated measures and the kind of model analysis stuff. And so that was one we kind of had to put to the side, even though we figured it's the most risky thing a wolf can do. We unfortunately didn't have quite enough data to look at it in as much depth as the other ones. I do think you're right, Stephen. I think that probably the wolves that are seen as habituated, certainly if they had toxo, if there was a good pattern there, maybe we'll be able to look at it in the future in a bit more, with more samples, more cases of habituated wolves versus non-habituated. It's a pretty complicated behavior, as Connor mentioned, with humans. there are so many things that contribute to an intelligent animal like a wolf's decision to, say, cross the road a certain distance from people, where they were raised, how used to traffic noise they are, whether someone tossed a hot dog out a window at them one time, whether even someone when they were young slammed a car door and freaked them out. Just some of them are more shy, some are more bold personality-wise. And I think trying to control for all of those things, because we aren't working in a laboratory setting, is really difficult. But we do everything we can in the wild system to control for as many factors as we think might be important. We just don't have and didn't have quite enough data to do that super rigorously with this analysis with habituation. We were able to with the dispersals and the leadership behaviors.
So cougars are, so the felines are really just the carriers. They are not affected by this. They are literally just the mediator between all other warm-bloodeds, correct? Is that essentially what happens? So they're just the vehicle for this thing to pass through and affect the rest of warm-blooded mammals and any warm-blooded, I guess, species, right? So they're essentially just doing their business. I mean, is this something like you guys did a PSA before, or Connor did a mini PSA before? I mean, is this something that really needs to be told to everyone out there who live in sort of mountain communities that have dogs that are walking around, they know that there's cougars around or bobcats or lynx or anything like that, that if they come across scat or anything where they know that there's some sort of prevalent marking, that they sort of need to stay away? What's the I guess the PSA that you would say for anyone out there who lives in and around wild felines that they would need to know?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I guess part one of kind of what you said, asked about are felids affected? The shortest answer is we're not really sure. We actually talked about this yesterday a little bit. And I, have in researching for this project that we were working on, and then just kind of in the last couple of days looking it up, there is evidence that felids do, when felids get infected, they pass oocysts, but there is also evidence that they do get these cysts on their muscle tissue. So it's possible and, maybe even likely that felids infected with toxo may show some of these same kind of, increases in testosterone and dopamine, which may cause these other behaviors that we're talking about. But there hasn't been a whole lot of research on felids themselves in the behavior realm. So there has been a lot of research on like how long do felids, pass oocysts, or kind of the more kind of technical stuff. And so short answer there is we don't know, but it's also really exciting that, that's still one thing that we don't know. As far as the second question, PSA with, dogs or any pet, coming across felid sign or cougar sign, bobcat sign. I think the biggest thing is like, nobody probably really wants their dogs eating any sort of scat. So that's always great to just stop them from doing that. And, to the other extent too, like if dogs are, depending on where you live, people are in mountainous areas, and dogs are off leash, like, yeah, odds are if they find cat scat, like they're going to take that before you see or anything notices. And I think there, maybe the biggest thing, and Kira, you can chime in here too, is the fact that, toxo again is for many, populations or for many species, like it's not going to completely change, let's say, your dog's behavior. It's, something that, again, like 1 in 3 humans has and doesn't know. And there are some, really interesting studies that have looked at human behavior and toxo that we could talk about as well. But I think that, toxo is not quite something that we need to be like overly vigilant or overly worried more than anything else. Unless, again, you are like your dog or, you as an individual or any of your pets are immunocompromised for any reason, or if if your dog, like becomes pregnant or anything like that. Like those are the cases that you really want to watch exposure to toxo. But for the most part, I don't think it's something that like the general public really needs to worry about. Like there's a history of when toxo was first kind of, let's say, quote unquote, discovered. There's like a huge backlash of like killing cats left and right. It's
Right.
We don't need it. I think that there's things, wash for individuals, like wash your hands, cook your meat, all that kind of stuff I talked about. But, for dogs, it kind of is just like, if, it's probably just better and safer for a number of reasons. If your dogs don't eat scat.
And this, despite the kind of like weird sci-fi feeling that you get when you hear, oh, you get exposed to this thing and then it takes over parts of your brain and hormones and changes behavior. It's actually, this has been shown in other things. Connor mentioned a couple of examples to me yesterday that he might get into, but we also wanted to mention another really cool podcast called This Podcast Will Kill You. They have an entire episode on toxoplasmosis, and they go into kind of like the humans and toxo a little bit more detail than we're able to in the history, so that we could kind of talk more about wolves, really. But they have a bunch of really good information. And Connor, you were mentioning like the flu, I think it was.
Oh yeah. So I guess like, broader, if we take it away, if we're talking about humans, we take it away from toxo specifically. And we just talk about any sort of parasite. And so like the flu virus, is a parasite. And there has been some evidence that individuals that were kind of exposed or inoculated with the dead flu virus. So anyone who gets the flu vaccine, generally it's a dead virus. But it still might have some of the, similar properties, though not infectious properties, that a live virus might be if you were exposed to the flu. And they found that individuals that kind of received the flu vaccine, were more sociable for about 48 hours after receiving the vaccine than individuals that were given a placebo. And this is really interesting because for the flu specifically, it lines up to the time period where you would start to actually become contagious to infect other people with the flu, but you wouldn't yet be showing symptoms. And so it's kind of hitting this line of like parasites, including viruses that have a really long evolutionary history. There might be some of these really subtle changes in behavior.
Similar with rabies as well. The virus wants to pass it on to another host before its original host dies. And so kind of does everything it can, gets in the saliva, makes rabid animals want to bite another animal and get their saliva all over it. And so there, we think about our decisions being always our own.
Crazy.
But it seems like we may be kind of controlled a little bit more by interesting little tiny things like parasites and viruses more than we even realize. And I'm sure that's, the wolves out there certainly think that they're making the decisions on their own. And I'm really interested if, you hear about these wolves that are traveling super long distances. They're very clearly dispersers, the ones that are going, from Yellowstone down to Colorado, or the one that went from Oregon all the way to Southern California. Are these ones that had toxo? These are kind of like the explorer kind of personality. And I would love to kind of look at that at a huge scale at some point and try and figure out, did those wolves that are making those really long distance movements, did they come from areas with a lot of cougars? I mean, that would be kind of fairly simple to ask and figure out, really.
So are we saying that there's a possibility that humans are infected in a similar way, meaning like in terms of this deterioration of risk assessment and the implications for leadership and our equivalent of whatever dispersal means to us, I mean, I know we're talking to wildlife experts, so I don't expect you to go into a lot of detail about the human aspect of this, but is there a simple yes or no answer to this? I mean, it does or probably does not affect humans in a similar way in terms of the mental experience.
Yeah. So this is the thing that Kira and I have talked about a lot, and we really want to get tested because it'd be super interesting to tell. So there is, the kind of the shout out that Kira had to This Podcast Will Kill You. They cover this super well with kind of the human element of it. And then I also wanted to shout out a book that I read a few times over the last few years called This Is Your Brain on Parasites by Kathleen McAuliffe. And so I think for, again, a lot of this gets back in a lot of the behavior stuff, everything we've kind of talked about today, like it always has to go into the context of so many, genetic, environmental factors go into behavior, right? And so it is really hard, and it, is kind of controversial to say like toxo causes this one thing. However, there have been a number of studies in humans that toxoplasmosis infection has led to, an increased likelihood of, is correlated with an increased likelihood of car accidents or motorcycle vehicle accidents. There's also some really interesting research that's just coming out now that Kira and I talked about a little bit recently, is that like there has been a few studies in college students in various different universities that those that are positive for toxo are actually rated as more symmetrical faces and more attractive by others.
What the hell are you talking? That's insane.
And so like some of this stuff is like, again, so much goes into this. Like it's not just.
So you don't want to get rid of it then if you have it, really. It sounds like there's sounds like it's awesome, actually.
It's the same thing, right? Where it's like, hey, I might be more attractive, but like I really like driving my motorcycle super fast.
Oh yeah,
like,
we need
how
to get
good
this.
is that actually?
Let's have a toxoplasmosis party. It's all good.
No, it is.
Right.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, there's some really interesting stuff. And like, it is really hard for us as humans to be like, oh, I don't want to be controlled by this tiny little parasite. And like, I don't think that's happening. But I think that, if you just look at like slight increases in dopamine and testosterone production, like the kind of science behind, hormones and, the stuff that has come with, looking at mental health and hormones and the effect of that, like tiny increases or decreases can have kind of huge effects.
That's insane.
And so, again, like a lot of this, there's so much more research that needs to be done on, toxo in humans. And of course, it needs to kind of be done in a way that you can control for as much as you can. Like I'm hopeful that, all of these studies are going to be observational, right? So it's not like somebody is going to go and experimentally like infect a bunch of people with toxo to see what they were like before versus after. And so, yeah, there's so much that needs to be done and so much that like we still need to understand about ourselves and about, brain chemistry and hormones. But yeah, it's really interesting. And, and this was one of the really exciting things for us as we were kind of talking about this again with one of our co-authors, Aaron Staylor. And then as we kind of pitched it to the Wolf Project, Doug Smith and Dan Staylor is like, hey, will you let us, kind of look at this? We didn't have any real literature about toxoplasmosis and the behavior effects in canids themselves. And so we really relied on like, okay, this is how rodents react. It's like, all right, that's, super compelling. This is how chimpanzees react. Is like, well, okay, that's, we, maybe not rightfully so, but we think, chimps are more related to humans. And so it's like, all right, maybe this kind of spreads different kind of mammalian orders. Then we look at how it affects humans. And it's like, well, if this affects wolves in any of these same ways, that can be really cool and really interesting. And so we kind of took all of this different information and again, we're thinking about it through the human lens of like, ooh, what is risky for a wolf? It's like, well, even for humans, leaving your family, that's pretty risky. Or, becoming a pack leader, that can also be incredibly risky. Or, maybe it pays off if you're super aggressive. And if, testosterone and dopamine production, especially testosterone, is linked to increased aggression, like, boom, there you go. And so it was really fun for us to, do a bunch of this kind of literature review and kind of go into a little uncharted territory. There was for us, Kira mentioned it before, that there is a paper done with kind of the whole camp group who studies hyenas over in they're Kenya, Tanzania. Yeah, Kira? Kenya. And so they had just come out with a paper. I think it was Eben Gehring was one of the co-lead authors on that. And they found that hyena cubs specifically that are infected with toxo are more likely to approach lions at closer distances. And so that was like, well, that seems kind of dumb if you're a cub. And so that was kind of the thing of like, oh, this is really interesting. And then they also found that, they found that adult hyenas, there was no difference between approach distance between toxoseropositive and toxoseronegative. And it's like, well, yeah, these animals interact, they, fight over carcasses. So of course that kind of makes sense. Like adult hyenas can hold their own against lions to some extent. But they also found that hyena cubs of all age class or hyenas of all age classes that were seropositive for toxo were more likely to be killed by lions. So that's kind of, again, this like infected hyenas are more likely to be consumed by lions, which is going to continue this life cycle and possibly continue to infect more hyenas, which are then going to get killed by lions, and things keep going. And so yeah, so that kind of came out right around when we were talking about this stuff, and that was like awesome. Like group living species, hyenas are, I always like to consider them a little bit of like Frankenstein. Like they're not quite canids, they're not quite felids, but they're, group living species that we can kind of compare to wolves a little bit. And so that was kind of one of the big things of like, cool, they found this thing, let's look at it in wolves. And, we don't have plains lions or cave lions or smilodons anymore. So we don't necessarily have something that can, have wolves be a part of that kind of trophic transmission where an infected wolf gets killed by a cat. However, like we still figure that, if you look at Toxoplasmosis, Toxoplasma gondii, it, has been around for thousands of years. And so there has been a fact where it has evolved with, mammals. And there was a time where wolves, or, what we have as gray wolves, were not at the top of the food chain. And so with, plains lions, cave lions, Smilodon, at a certain point, like they probably could have contributed to this trophic cycle and continuing kind of in this way. And so it was really interesting for us to kind of look at kind of how that worked. And I guess, I don't know, Kira, if you want to talk about kind of the wolf cougar relationship a little bit.
On the kind of evolutionary scale of thinking about the Pleistocene North American suite of mammals, wolves were not kind of this like top apex predator that we think of them as now. They were kind of mid-sized compared to a lot of others, and probably were on the menu for things like, saber-tooth lions, the North American cheetah even. And so right now we're just left with gray wolves and mountain lions and some other carnivores, of course, but the relationship between felids and the largest canid now is, it's not really that dangerous for a wolf. They're not very often killed by mountain lions, although it does happen once in a while where, maybe a toxo-positive wolf occasionally is killed by a mountain lion if it's by itself. And then, of course, it's completing that life cycle. Occasionally, wolves will kill a mountain lion if it, for some reason, can't get to escape terrain. Usually they can get to a tree pretty quickly, and then they do the whole dog cat dance of cat in a tree hissing and dogs, barking and jumping up at the tree for a while, and that's about it. But if a wolf is able to catch a mountain lion, or a wolf pack, I should say, is able to catch a mountain lion away from escape terrain, they might catch it and kill it and eat it. It's not a super common thing that happens, but it would be another way for this kind of life cycle to continue, because they would be further exposed by consuming the mountain lion then.
I'm going to be thinking about this for ages too, right? Because it's like,
stuff.
I seem to think of stuff like this in terms of, I guess, the advantage to evolution, or wondering why evolution would select for it.
Yeah.
This one will just send me down a rabbit hole. But like, my mind goes to, is this an evolutionary process that leads individuals with better immunity to become more likely to breed? Because if you can have this thing living in you and you can still thrive, then maybe it's an honest signal of overall health. So it motivates those individuals to become bolder leaders and therefore find themselves in a high risk but high reward place, which I guess the ultimate reward for critters seems to be passing genes on.
Yeah.
But it's just like, this one's crazy.
It definitely comes back around to the hormone interaction stuff that Connor was talking about, where just that little bit of an increase of testosterone, it might, or dopamine, it might mask any kind of, weaknesses really. If you have a weakened immune system or something, some extra testosterone for a few weeks during the breeding season might be all you need to be super successful. And for a wolf, if you're able to breed for just 1 or 2 years, that's probably the best out of your cohort.
Incredible. Nature's wild.
It really is. It just teaches us more about ourselves. I mean, that's the best part, is you guys doing the work about wolves, and then it leads down the human path, and then we learn more stuff. I mean, nature's cool, people.
Where do you get tested for this? I mean, how would you get tested for
I think, Kira, did you look into it? I think you can maybe get tested. I don't know. Yeah, Kira, go ahead.
I asked at one point, just at like a kind of regular doctor appointment checkup, and I want to say I was quoted as somewhere around like $80 or $90 for it to be added to, where you do like a blood test where they test your levels of like red blood cells, white blood cells, all that kind of stuff. Just add it to it. And I think that it's pretty typical test for people who are pregnant and very early on, just to see if they already have it and to see how kind of cautious they have to be for if they have a cat at home for the rest of that pregnancy. And so, I think that a lot of kind of clinics or doctors have the capability of doing it just for a fee.
Yeah. And maybe that's one thing, I don't know if we mentioned it before, that, for immunocompromised people or persons who, can or want to become pregnant, toxoplasmosis, if you're not in that primary acute stage, which again only lasts kind of 2 to 4 weeks, you're generally fine. So if you find out that you're positive for toxo, and then years later you become pregnant, odds are it's okay. It's really just that acute phase when your immune system is trying to fight off the infection. However, and again, there's more in that other podcast that we mentioned. There are the chances where, and this kind of came up in the 80s during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where toxoplasmosis, kind of the interaction, because HIV and AIDS, decrease the immune system, make you immunosuppressed. It actually is very dangerous for those people. So there's kind of that side of it, and as well as the fact that there is some chance that if let's say you have toxo, it goes into that secondary kind of chronic phase where there's no symptoms. There is a chance that if something happens to your immune system, it can almost kind of reactivate. And you go back into that acute phase. And so that's why, for, a number of different reasons, you do want to, if you are pregnant, capable of becoming pregnant, want to become pregnant, you kind of want to know if you have toxo. And then also that's when you're really going to want to be careful, because even if you are in that chronic phase, you still can get reinfected by ingesting more oocysts or ingesting infected meat. And so there's kind of a little bit of this of like toxo in itself, like you really only need to be super careful kind of for that first 2 to 4 weeks of infection. And then after that, like you don't really know that you're infected. You know, it's not like you necessarily get infected, go through the acute phase, and then decide to buy a motorcycle. Super subtle.
Wait, I just did that. And
Steven's infected.
The cats were sleeping on the cow hay for a long time. So maybe that was.
There you go, buddy.
That was the process of me buying one.
You never know. Like
makes a lot of sense.
That's one of the things where maybe you can just like blame all your stupid decisions on
the cats.
The parasite.
I actually love it. And this part about the pregnancy, I do know because we actually just had a little guy this last week, and I was responsible for the cat litter every day for 10 months, which is the worst part of having a cat. So it's definitely a cheat code to not have to change the litter.
Congratulations. Yeah,
thank you. You know what we all need to do? We actually, and I really mean this, if you guys are going to get tested for this, John and I should try to get tested as well around the same time, or even if it's a few weeks apart, and then we'll release the results on the podcast.
We should.
Totally.
Oh my God. We need to do that.
Let's freaking do that.
Oh my God. We got to do that. This conversation's been fascinating.
Yeah.
Connor and Kira, when is the paper getting finished, and where are people going to be able to see it and view it and get all the stuff from you guys?
It is in review right now. We actually finished our kind of like first round of revisions. It went back out. So this is kind of like second round with peer review. Hopefully it will be accepted. We have yet to hear kind of like the official word on that, and we will hope to hear in about a month. So we will keep you guys updated.
Nice. Yeah, no, when you guys get it, when it's officially, good to go, which obviously we know it will be, just give us the info. We're definitely going to put it in the description, and we'll update everything on that.
Sounds good. We also made some, I'm really pleased with how some of the infographics and the figures turned out in the paper as well. And so we can share those. We tried to make a couple of them, for the public, and telling the entire story kind of piece by piece, what we talked about all today throughout that whole ecosystem cycle. And people can kind of follow that feedback loop to get, the gist of how it goes through the system.
So I can post that, the schematic, I think it's schematic 3 or something like that. Can I post that in the post when this episode's released so people can look at it? Yeah,
that sounds good. It'll be the last one with the cougars and the wolves together.
Yep, I see that one. I'm looking at that one now.
No, this has been great. You guys, we could talk about this all day. If I didn't have to, we could still be going.
I can't wait till the rest of it comes out.
I know. I'm looking forward to this.
We'll do a follow-up.
Yes, we're going to do a follow-up once it's there. And this is tremendous. Kira, thanks for coming back on. Connor, it was great to meet you, and just keep doing what you guys are doing. I mean, this is tremendous, tremendous work. And obviously it affects everybody. Amazingly, it affects everyone, as people have learned. So thank you guys both for coming on and sharing this impressive research. It's really, really awesome. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us. We obviously
thanks for
clearly love what we do, and so it's a pleasure.
Always welcome.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, this is great. How's to everybody out there, and Steven, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the donate tab, and find out more information.